Here are 5 mastering settings that new producers and mixers. And if you're doing any of these, simply changing them is going to improve your masters. Not tenfold, but they're subtle improvements, and they're improvements that are free. You just have to click a button or move a thing and it's done. You don't have to do any work for them. So let's get on with it. The first one, widely debated. What should you set your limiter ceiling to? I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to show you and give you the whole scientific explanation. Should it be -1? No. Should it be -2? No. Plain and simple, 8 times oversampling with a -0.2 ceiling. Now, why specifically this? Let's get into the science of it. Okay, so you've probably noticed if you've had your ceiling at 0, sometimes on your meters it reads over 0. Why is that? Well, because digital waveforms have discrete sample-bound time signals. And if we look over here, that's each of these sample points. So when your limiter is set to here, let's say, and where's my little marker here? When your limiter is set to there, you're limiting that sample. But what you're not accounting for is this part over the top, which is the intersample peak. And that's the reconstructed waveform, and that's indiscrete. That's continuously recalculated based on where the sample points lie. So then you get overreads. This is a conundrum. We don't want that. We want to stay below the ceiling, because then when we go out into the real world and people play it on their CD player, in their car, or whatever system they have, their D to A converter might not be as advanced as the ones we have in the studio and might actually not take favorably to these intersample peaks, and you get distortions. That's not good. Okay, I'm moving a bit fast, but what are we meant to do here? So the first thing is, if you look at ITU BS1770, this is a documentation by the International Telecommunications Union, and it documents exactly how to meter the true peak value. And in this, it actually shows how much the maximum underread could be. So at 4 times oversampling, you've got a 0.5 decibel discrepancy. At 8 times, a 0.136 discrepancy. That's why with this here, I said do 8 times oversampling and a ceiling of 0.2. Okay, that's just as a general sort of thing, because if you're doing 8 times oversampling on a 48 kilohertz session, you're going to have a read error of 0.16 or 0.13. And then if your ceiling is at -0.2, you're never going to go over that 0 ceiling. Perfect, that's solved. So what I'll do is I'll quickly show you this in action. So we've got the limiting going on here, super heavy limiting, and oversampling is off. We've got the ceiling at -0.2, but we're going to get overreads by doing this naturally. So there are overreads there, plus 0.4, plus 0.3. Now we'll turn the oversampling on, 8 times oversampling. And what that's going to do is, we've got overreads -0.1. That might hit 0 at some point, but it's not going to go over 0. The next thing is turn off linear phase EQ. There is a use case for linear phase EQ, and I'm going to tell you in a second, but just turn it off as a general rule. Right? Take a listen. This is natural phase, so it's an infinite impulse response. So everything that happens with the EQ filter is going to happen after the initial transient or that impulse. So have a listen to this kick drum. Rings out, but that's part of the actual tone of the kick. Now listen to what happens before the kick when I put it into linear phase. You see that little ramp up? That's a finite impulse response, and that's the linear EQ compensating for that phase relationship of that EQ boost. Now, you're going to do a 16 decibel boost at 62 hertz? Probably not. But the reality is, once you start carving your track and actually EQing and manipulating it, don't use linear phase EQ, because all of those subtle little amounts and shifts with a finite impulse response that linear EQ needs to operate is going to murk your transients. Simple. So if you're using a left-right stereo EQ, don't use linear phase mode, turn it off. Now, I did say at the start of this, there is a use case for linear phase EQ. And the reason why we want to use linear phase on mid-side EQs is the way mid-side is encoded and decoded. So you have your left plus right, which equals your mid, and your left minus right, which equals your side. Okay? And that's the phase relationship. So left plus right positive, so everything that is similar. Left minus right, so left minus right means right phase inverted, gives you your side, and then to come back you do the opposite and you get your left and right recoded or decoded back in the stereo. Now, if your phase relationship on the side signal is shifting because of your EQ, it's going to change the stereo field. So simple, no linear phase EQ for general EQing application, but if you're using mid-side EQ, use linear phase mode so you don't warp or ruin your stereo field relationship. The next one is if you have a clipper, if you have any distortion or harmonic saturators, make sure they have oversampling. Or at least run some tests to make sure you're not getting aliasing distortion back into your signal. Now that style of distortion, I'll show you what happens. So we've got this signal here, it's playing a high frequency sine wave. Now we're going to add a clipper. Oh, wait a second. What are all these other frequencies popping up? Well, those are the harmonics from the clipper that don't fit into the sample rate because this is a 48 kilohertz and the harmonics are above 48 kilohertz. It folds them down and those frequencies are not harmonic. They sound really weird. So what do? Well, we expand the bandwidth of the sample rate, which this clips. So if we go 2 times, we remove some of that aliasing. 4 times, you get rid of enough of it that it's inaudible. And then as you go higher, it gets rid of more of it. So simple as this. Do run this test. Run a signal generator, get your harmonic saturators in, add a high frequency, and then clip, distort, add some saturation and see how well this works. Now, you wouldn't want any noise above about -80 because then you're starting to get into territory where you might start to hear it. Simple as that, a small little setting, oversample, clippers, and saturators. The next one is always have dither turned on, all right? If you're running a 24-bit session, practically it might go down to 16-bit if you need to export it for CD or CD baby. Always have dither on, and I'll explain to you why, all right? Let's just play a 24-bit file, then a 16-bit file with no dither, and then a 16-bit file with dither, and then I'll actually tell you exactly what it's doing. Okay, so what you're hearing there is actually truncation distortion. Truncation is the process of discarding the lowest bits when lowering bit depth. So you've got 24 bits, and then you go down to 16, and what's going to end up happening is numbers are rounded to the lowest value, which isn't a big issue with loud signals. So everything in that's super loud in the top part of your signal isn't going to be affected. It's the very lowest bits that get discarded because of rounding. So when you're rounding from, let's say, 200.9, which might be a particular amplitude signal, down to 200, that's a read error of about 0.5%. You're not going to hear that at all. However, when the lowest bits truncate, let's say your value at 24 bits is 1.9 and it has to go to a whole number of 1, that's a read error of 90%, and that's what ends up causing that truncation distortion. So the way dither works is it adds a little bit of noise to the very lowest bit of information. And what that noise does, it actually randomizes those amplitude values so that way it smooths out the tail. So by having that noise in there, it actually smooths out the tail so you don't get that crackling distortion. So simple, add dither. Okay, it's not going to make the rest of your master sound great, but those little tails, the reverbs at the end of things, when you're going down to 16-bit, people will hear it. And you don't want people to hear that. That sounds no good. Now, number 5, I don't know if I'm right or wrong on this because this is something I practiced, but then I did the tests and the tests didn't disprove me, but they didn't approve my hypothesis or the way I work. And that is the fact that you should always work at the sample rate of the material or the session's material. So if you produce something in 44.1 or 48, guess what? Master it in 44.1 or 48. And the reason, or my theory behind it, and then I'll show you the tests because the tests don't necessarily approve my theory. The theory is that every time you upsample or downsample, so resamplers use all pass and high pass filters in order to add new sample point values in. Okay, so you're adding a low pass or an all pass, depending whether you're going up or down in sample rate. And that's not necessarily desirable. You don't want to add more filters. You don't want to add more processes to your signal. So I was always of the nature, and I still am of the nature because I still got to look into this further for you guys. But I was always of the nature, work at the native sample rate. Tests are so important. So I'll show you something fun I did because this is how I spend my time. Is I got a signal. Okay, so if we look at these files up here, and then I oversampled it to 96. Then I took that 96 and 2 times oversampled it, and then I oversampled it back to 96. And then back out at 44.1, which is the native sample rate of that original signal, to null test. Okay, and I did the same thing with the shifted sync wave, which is just that sync wave that's at 1 impulse. Okay, now with the impulse when I did this and I went up to 96 and then back down and all around, there was a negative 50 decibel difference in the signals, which to me is, you can't hear it in here, but negative 50 decibels of a constant signal beneath the noise floor is audible in most mixers and masters. So you can see here the peak value is negative 50, nulled. Okay, so that's the original, and then that's the upsampled, oversampled, back down and out version. So they're both. So I've got a negative 50 underread, which I wouldn't want to be upsampling anything or adding extra processes and resampling because of this. However, I thought, that's great. This is proving my theory. Let's get a full mix and do the exact same thing, because if it's like this on a single impulse, it's going to be worse across a whole track. However, guess what happened? It was actually better on this material to the point where it was so low in the noise floor, I think it's negligible. So look at this. So you've got your normal 44.1 version, and then you've got your 44.1 that's been upsampled to 96, 2 times oversampled, then it's went back to 96, and then out at 44.1. I wanted to add as many processes in there to replicate what you'd do in a session if you upsampled it and then added a processor with oversampling, and then you had to export it. Look at this null test. See that? It's at negative 76, negative 80, even in the loudest bits here. So I'm playing that through, and that's what I'm getting. Those are the readings I'm getting. To me, and I have to be honest with when I give a recommendation, that is negligible. So you can actually run your sessions at a higher or lower sample rate than what you originally produced them in. My advice would be to keep it native, because I'm still not conclusive on this. And this is going to be my first piece of advice, but it ended up becoming confusing to even me when I was setting up this video. But basically, you shouldn't be too stressed about this right now. I got to look into it a little bit more. To me, adding any difference of noise or difference in the filtering or representation of the mix that you're getting can be problematic, so I try and avoid it. So you should try and avoid it maybe where you do not work at higher sample rates than what the mix is at. However, I got to do a little bit more investigating, or if you know something, let me know in the comment section below, because this test, even at its loudest, it's negative 60, and that's when it starts to get into the realm of could be audible. But even then, that's such a slight difference that nobody's going to pick it up on an AB. So that final way you might be fucking up your masters might not actually be fucking up your masters. How's that for an end to the video? I wanted to show you that because I'm not always right, and everything is always in constant evolution, and I'm always trying to improve myself. So when I come across something like this that doesn't approve my thoughts and doesn't necessarily disprove it, it just adds a little question mark where I go, maybe I can oversample all my sessions and work at a high sample rate. What's the benefit of that? Well, that's another discussion for another video, but I'm going to leave you there because I'm pretty puffed out, and yeah, I got to get back to some sessions. So until next time, take care.